guess. The right-hand side, the pink, is the value of the commodity as seen by the capitalist, okay? So they just see that they're able to sell their commodity at a higher amount than what they paid for it. The difference is the addition to the cost. So I've kind of rehearsed this already. Just going to go into a little bit more detail. That Marx identifies the rate of profit around, in the end, 3 variables, okay? The first of those variables is the rate of surplus value, okay, which we've already identified. And the second of those variables is this relation between the variable capital and the total capital advanced, okay? There's one other element to this which we'll come on to. In chapter 3 of volume 3, Marx looks at how the rate of surplus value, which he now gives the denotation, this S dash, stands for the rate of surplus value. And in that discussion, he actually does recognize wages as one of the determinants of the rate of surplus value, quite rightly, in my view, substantiating our overall argument. Well, that is different to what he's later on to write. He reduces that down to 3 in chapter 17 of volume 1. Okay, so it is very clear that the level of wages affects the rate of surplus value. Okay, and what he does in chapter 3 then is, he, again, in his typically exhaustive manner, he checks all the different ways in which these different variables may affect the rate of profit. Okay, some of them are slightly, unlikely to occur, but even if they seem unlikely, if they're logically possible, Marx investigates them. Okay, so I want to summarize part 1 of volume 3. He's up to this point, he's still saying that the transition from surplus value into profit is a change in form, but not a change in magnitude. So surplus value becomes profit, and at the level of each individual capital, it realizes the same profit as the surplus value produced by the workers that they themselves exploit. Okay, that's the story so far up to the end of part 1. Okay, so the individual capital is the unit of analysis, and it's the individual capital which represents capital as such. Okay, but Marx is already beginning to tell us towards the end of part 1 that there's a limit to this approach, because he's actually opening up a discussion of commodity chains. He opens up the possibility that certain capitals exploit gain from the exploitation of workers by other capitals. I think that slide is slightly out of sequence, actually. I'm going to give you more from the content of part 1. I've realized I've given you a summary before I've given you all the detail, okay? But maybe it'll help. There's a third element to the definition of the rate of profit from the rate of surplus value. We've got the rate of surplus value, this S dash. We've got the relationship between variable capital and the total capital advance, this V over C. And it's at this point that Engels, as an editor, brings in, quite rightly, the question of turnover. And what turnover does is it effectively increases the annual rate of surplus value. So a given rate of surplus value of 100% is effectively higher if there is more than one turnover in a year. And it's higher not because there's more surplus value produced by the workers during a year. That does not vary with the turnover, but what varies is the variable capital required to get that surplus value. So the surplus value is the same, but the variable capital is less according to how many turnovers there are in a year. In other words, the capitalist has to can keep circulating the money they pay out as wages, and rather than having to pay 50 weeks wages, they pay 10 weeks wages 5 times, because they get the money back and they can pay it out again. So they don't have to invest so much money in the wage. So Marx comes up with his formula for the rate of profit, which is the rate of surplus value times the number of turnovers in the year times the proportion of variable capital to the total capital. These two chapters are really, really narrative-like. They're less sort of deductive and analytical, but they're also really important. This is, if you like, where the history and the geography really does come in. And what Marx writes about here is how capital works to reduce costs. This is the first time he really bears in on this point, and he does it very effectively, I have to say. And he says this in two ways. He says, first of all, you can use constant capital in a more economic way, basically cost cutting in the production process. So it's how constant capital is used. And this could have come straight out of volume 1. I mean, you're talking about worse conditions, health and safety, and so on. So in other words, the capitalists don't spend the money to put a guard on the machine, and the workers are injured as a result. This is an economy in the use of constant capital. The other economy is pushing for a reduction in price. And Marx looks at this in terms of cotton, wool, and flax, all related to textiles. Now, this is, I was a bit more guarded in my praise for this section. I'm glad he's doing this because it brings in other workforces potentially into the picture. These are the beginning of commodity chain analysis, in fact, right? But generally speaking, he sees the cost reduction here as a result of increased productivity rather than economies arising from greater exploitation. And even when he looks at cotton, he's waxing lyrical again about the cotton gin and so on. But of course, it's also about how cheap, violently enforced racialized labor was as well. Okay, so here, capital labor as a cost, but not as value. Okay, so cost reduction. So now I just want to reflect on this, and if you can bear with me, the other slide should probably have come in here. What Marx does achieve is he discovers the basic internal connection between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. Now, to us looking on it now, we look at it and think, oh, this is pretty obvious. It's quite clear. We can follow the argument. This took Marx 10 years of work to work this out. Marx, okay, you know, he looked at not it as a product, but he looked at the difference, you know, 20% and 100%. He had to work at this to find out what the connection was, right? So the rate of profit increases with the rate of surplus value, and it increases with turnover, but it decreases as the organic capital rises. And this is because this is when more capital is invested in constant capital than variable capital, okay? And I've already given you that example. Now, the reason for this, by the way, is why does the rate of profit decrease as the organic composition of capital rises? It's because the rate of profit is based on surplus value. And the fewer workers in proportion that capital employs, then the less surplus value is being produced. So as a proportion of the total capital outlaid, the surplus value will reduce in proportionate terms, and hence the rate of profit will reduce. So this point brings me to anticipating the next part of volume 3, part 2. In part 2, Marx looks at the rate of profit not any longer at the level of an individual capital, but at the level of a sector, an industrial sector, such as locomotive production or spinning of cotton and so on, right? The rate of profit there is the product of the rate of surplus value and the inverse of the organic composition. But Marx then, in developing his argument, only looks at one of those two variables. In fact, on one of the three variables, if we include turnover, right? He only proceeds by looking at differences in organic composition while holding surplus value at a common level. So all the workers in the different sectors are being exploited to the same degree. So he's presuming a common rate of surplus value within one country. He's very explicit about this, okay? So although we know that the rate of surplus value is a real factor conditioning both the value composition and the mass of surplus value, it's not part of Marx's solution in part 2. Now, were we to do so, then we would have to modify and develop beyond Marx's solution. What we'd have to do is to look at a second dimension of differentiation and variability, which slightly abstract general term, I've said social region. So where commodities are produced under more or less oppressive conditions of exploitation, there will be different rates of surplus value. So this will require a further modification to Marx's concept of price of production. And from that, we can begin to see from within the dynamic relations of capital, the basis of imperial relations within the capitalist mode of production itself, as in other words, as internal to the way capitalism produces commodities. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you've borne with me. I welcome any questions and discussion. Thanks very much and look forward to you next time.